I'm here with Angela Alaimo O'Donnell, who teaches courses at in American Catholic Studies, English, and Creative Writing at Fordham University. O'Donnell is the author of The Province of Joy, based on the prayer practices and theological imagination of Flannery O'Connor, in the 3 full-length collection of poems. In her new book, Mortal Blessings, A Sacramental Farewell, which is beautifully written, is an exploration of caregiving in the context of the Catholic imagination. So, Angela, thanks so much for taking a few minutes to talk with us about your new book.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, we just thought it would be great to have you talk a little bit about the stories you put inside the book, and maybe people who are interested can start to relate to it a little bit. And the story really is about a story about you, your family, and your mother, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about your mother and the story there that you're telling?
Absolutely. I know that all of our families are different. We all have very unique relationships with our parents. But there are certain patterns that kind of emerge, and I think the story that I'm telling is very particular to us, but I think that there's enough in it that's universal that a number of people will respond to. At least this is what I've been told by friends who have read the book and have read some of the poems that are in the book as well. My mother was a very unique person. She had 5 children. My father died when she was a relatively young woman, leaving her a young, pretty widow. And so there were 5 of us who were just kind of trying to fend for ourselves while she was trying to find her way as a woman in the world. This is in an era when there were not very many single-parent families. And so each of us had a very distinctive relationship with her, dependent upon our age. So growing up, we grew up, let's say, under difficult circumstances, challenging circumstances. So I know a lot of friends of mine who write about their mothers. They have these wonderful, close, tight-knit relationships, and they've been best girlfriends all their lives. And that was never really my experience. So it was really a great challenge, but also a privilege to me when my mother grew older and became ill, to be there to take care of her. Because what it provided for us was an opportunity to mend fences that had not been mended for decades and decades. It gave us an opening, an opportunity, what I call in the book Kairos time, during which we really didn't have to accomplish anything serious. It was really just the daily business of keeping her alive, of feeding her, of keeping her amused, of talking with her, of helping her make calls on her cell phone. And they were, even though she was in pain and she was, definitely deteriorating in terms of her health, there was this kind of wonderful sense in the room with her and with my sisters of an awareness that these were the last days that we would spend together. And they were among the best days we had ever spent together. And so the book tries to capture that strange paradox that in the face of suffering, you find these redeeming moments that you are so grateful for.
If I can ask, you're a teacher of English, creative writing, Catholic studies. What was it like recounting that experience in writing? I'm assuming it was a challenge for you. How did you get it all down on paper in such an eloquent way?
It was a challenge, an interesting challenge. I had written some poems. As a poet, that's kind of my go-to mode. But when you're writing poems are they're like fleeting glimpses, little flashes of light that you get, and flashes of language as well. And so you spend a little bit of time with a particular moment, and you write the poem, and then you move on. This was a very different kind of project. It required me daily to go back into that room and to remember particular events and particular objects and conversations. Part of it was joyful. I was glad to go back there, but also part of it was very difficult. So I was very glad to have done it, but there were days when I thought, oh, I don't want to go in the cave again, and have to, remember this particular thing, because they're just some very poignant moments. However, having gotten them down, I'm very grateful to have gotten them down on paper, because I feel in some way as though, and this is of course the illusion that art always gives us, I feel as though I've kind of captured them, and like a snapshot, it's there. And I can revisit it if I want to. I can share it with other people, hopefully other readers. I shared it with my sisters who were absolutely profoundly moved and glad to have some record of the experience that we had. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to have done it, but it was more difficult than writing poetry.
So you kind of place the stories within the context of something called the Catholic imagination and an idea of sacrament, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But I don't know, maybe can you explain where that came from? That idea of being able to look at those stories, those memories within that context. Where did that come from?
I'm kind of obsessed in many ways with the kind of Catholic imagination and the Catholic viewpoint. I'm very aware of the fact that it's part of my makeup as a writer, as an artist, and certainly a huge part of the way I see the world. And I think that's true of many of my students, many of whom are Catholic, of many of the writers that I like to read. Andre Dubus, for example, is a writer that I cite at the very beginning of the book, and in many ways I credit him. He's not living anymore, but his work still is. I credit him with the idea for this book, where he talks about the fact that everyday moments where we perform an action for someone else using common materials, and that action is predicated on love, and it is in some way connects us with the larger unseen world that we're a part of, whether we're aware of that or not, becomes sacramental. And he says, the church says there are 7 sacraments, but I say no, there are 70 times 7, quoting Jesus, of course. And that there's a sense in which everything, almost everything that we do is sacramental. And that's a very Catholic way to think about the world. The sense in which the rituals that we enact have meaning beyond themselves. They also always involve the physical. We're very bodily centered, Catholics are. And you really have such a powerful sense. I don't think I've ever had more powerful a sense of the body than in the sick room with my mother. Because you're just aware of the body's, first of all, how amazing it is that it lives for all these years and continues to function. And then when it begins to break down, how very fragile it is, and how very beautiful it is. And we are so attached to our bodies. They define us in so many ways. They limit us, but also they enable us to do everything. And there just really was this powerful sense for me of the attachment we ourselves felt to our mother's body. And we all came from her. I mean, that wonderful, bizarre, miraculous fact was very real to us as we were bathing her and changing her and such. And of course, we all have children of our own. So we were also aware of our own children having come from us and from her, and also from the people before her. So you really begin to feel connected with eternity when you ponder the body. But you do it through the physical, you don't leap over it. You have to do it through the physical. And so that's why it seemed to me that this experience of taking care of someone who is ill and someone who is failing, someone you love, gives you insights that are more profound than any that you can get in a book. It's purely experiential.
Yeah, and I love the way that you're expressing this idea, this sacramental worldview, that we're not saying anything about putting aside the catechetical 7 sacraments of the church, but just to see the world in that way, and especially that the context of the experience you had with your mother is just a really, really incredible way of viewing the world. How do you, aside from this context, how do you think maybe in your work as a teacher you're able to get that message across to either students or the people that you meet of this beautiful perspective that we have as Catholics of seeing the world sacramentally? What are some ways you've been able to do that or communicate that?
Well, for one thing, I have them read great writers who are immersed in that world and who feel that very strongly. So a writer like Andre Dubus or a writer like Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, there are any number, Thomas Merton, any number of Catholic writers who really value the sacramental and create fictional worlds and semi-fictional worlds in the case of Merton, and poetic worlds that embody exactly this way of seeing the world. The students actually, most of the students I teach the majority of them are Catholic, and they they have absorbed that worldview without really being fully aware of it. And when it's pointed out to them, they're joyful. Because they sometimes get confused, because there is a sort of a dark Jansenistic theology that sometimes goes along with the church that seems to look to the body as only a source of sin.
Right.
But of course, it's not. It's, the incarnation is a sign of the glory of the body, and the fact that Christ took on the human body and the central image of our church is the cross with that beautiful human body on it. It's the means of redemption as well as the means of sin. And so for them, it's a rather joyful discovery that a lot of what they love in the world, they should continue to love, because the world is good. The creation is good. It's fallen, but it's good. And that gives them a sort of a sense of empowerment, I think, in terms of their own faith, because they know all this instinctively, and they know how to love the world and the body instinctively, and they're happy to know that their faith teaches this as well. So that's my privilege and pleasure to be able to lead them into those discoveries.
That's wonderful. It's a wonderful experience, I'm sure, for them, and a good outlook, and as they grow into be adults and young adults in the church. So I wonder if I can take you back to the stories a little bit in the context that you brought to your own life, and just kind of take us through some of these sacraments that you talked about in the book. For example, one is the cell phone in the wheelchair. Can you tell us a little bit about that particular sacramental view?
Absolutely. In fact, I was just thinking about that's probably the one sacrament that most of my students would most be able to see and agree with. Our cell phones. I mean, we just love our cell phones. We have them next to our bodies all the time. We always know where they are. We cradle them in our hands. We look to them like oracles or talismans, and they really are quite wonderful. With a click of a button, you can be in touch with your child. In my case, I have a child who lives in Minneapolis. I can be in touch with him instantaneously, 1,000 miles away. You can send texts and messages. You can send pictures. You can look at photographs that you've taken of your children's weddings, or your grandchild, or your beloved parent who's very far away from you when you're at school, your boyfriend or your girlfriend. So you have all of your beloveds in the palm of your hand, in your pocket, in your purse all the time. So on a daily basis, we recognize how important that is. It becomes tremendously important when you are bedbound and in the hospital. And it's interesting. I actually had the experience. I've never been I've been very fortunate. I've never had to go to the hospital. But while I was in the middle of writing this book, I had to spend 8 days in the hospital. I had an illness that they could not figure out what it was. And it was, first of all, horrible. I never knew how terrible it is to be a patient in a hospital, how difficult it is, because you're so vulnerable. And I was so grateful for my cell phone. Because it enabled me to be in contact with the outside world. And so I had already conceived of writing this chapter from my mother's perspective about how important the cell phone was, but it made me realize it from my own personal perspective as well. And what I thought was sacramental about it from my mother's perspective is, we would go through the ritual of the phone calls every day. She would say, call my sister Dorothy. And so we would call Aunt Dorothy. And she would talk with her maybe just for 2 minutes, tell her how she felt, what she was doing, what she had eaten, what was hurting that particular moment. And then she would get tired. I'm done. Who do you want to call now? And it would surprise us. She would say, oh, I want to call, my husband, one of her sons-in-law, which was not a common thing for our mother to want to do. But she just wanted to let everybody know how she was doing, because she knew everybody loved her and everybody cared about her. And so this little mechanism, this little computer became a lifeline. And we would just do this every day. And she would be tired at the end of it, but she would feel gratified that everyone was thinking about her. And it made her very happy. It was a conduit of love, really. The cell phone became a conduit of love. So a simple little everyday material object, ordinary object, transformed to something that has transcendent value. to enable to make her feel loved. And the same with the wheelchair on a different level, most people, what struck me is most people think of wheelchairs as when they see someone in a wheelchair, well, that must be so difficult, to get around in life, to function. Even Andre Dubus, who was wheelchair bound, talks about this in his book. But for my mother, the day that we found out that she could get in the wheelchair, it was like a, get out of jail free card. It was a way for her to have wheels and to have locomotion, because with a broken hip, there was no way for her to walk. And so it became a means, not just a means of transportation, getting from one place to another. But, as we would take her around the building, it became a kind of daily pilgrimage as we would go to these various places that she wanted to go to, some of which she had to go to for her medical routines and such. But nonetheless, and also the fact that she needed us to push her, which also put me in the position of, being behind her, and which reminded me again of my childhood, where she would push me around in a baby stroller, push me around in a grocery cart. That role was reversed, and I was privileged to be able to do for her what she had done for me. So it's a sign of love, another small sign of love that I could show her in thanksgiving and gratitude for what she had done for me.
Beautiful. Beautiful illustration, I think, of what you're talking about. This is our cell phone, which we take for granted in our pocket, and how powerful that can be. Same thing with the wheelchair. Just not just a place for mobility, but just a pilgrimage, really. Can you tell us more? What are some of the other sacraments in the book that you really were drawn to initially in writing the book?
I think in some ways the central chapter for me was, and it was in many ways a chapter that transformed the book, is the central chapter, which is the longest one, called the Sacrament of Beauty. Mm-hmm. Most people don't think of beauty in connection with dying and with illness. It's the failure of beauty. It's the absence of beauty.
Okay, so you just started talking to us a little bit about the Sacrament of Beauty. Can you go into that story a little bit more?
Sure. I sort of got the idea for this because my mother was always a person who was very interested in beauty, beautiful things. She herself always, took great care of her appearance. She was a very striking looking, dark-skinned Italian woman. As a child, she used to model herself on Elizabeth Taylor, so she had a kind of movie star appeal, movie star quality. And when I was a young person, I was the youngest of the three daughters. I used to think that this was as I got a little older, a sign of shallowness on my mother's part. She was so preoccupied with her appearance. She wasn't really interested in, for example, doing well in school, which I was very interested in. So I thought of this as something that divided us for a long time. But then as I got older and wiser, and I began to be a little bit more charitable in my understanding of my mother, I realized, for one thing, her generation was one in which a woman's attractiveness was everything, and the culture that she came out of. And so she can hardly be blamed for being shaped by that culture. But also, she just loved beautiful things. She used to tap dance as a kid. She had a lovely soprano voice. She used to sing in church. She was attracted to beautiful things. And I was reminded of, I always loved the quotation by St. Augustine, one of St. Augustine's poems, "Late have I loved you, beauty, so old and so new. Late have I loved you." And it's beauty that arrests us. It's beauty that draws us to God. Even though we may not express it in that way, it shocks us out of our everyday, ordinary perceptions when we see something beautiful, and it makes us joyful. It makes us grateful for the fact of beauty. So when we were in that sick room with my mother, there isn't really very much beautiful that's in there. And my sisters and I decided that was our task, to try to bring as much beauty into the room as possible. For one thing, we wanted to take care of my mother and try to help her to look her best. So one sister and I went shopping, and we bought her a bunch of clothes. And it was ridiculous. We just bought all of these lovely things that, she could wear around the hospital, thinking that she would be there for a long time. So we raced through the store as if we were buying things for our daughters, never mind for our mother. We brought them back, and we were sort of modeling them for her, and she was delighted to have these clothes. My other sister, who owns her own beauty shop and is a hairdresser, cut my mother's hair. She gave her a bob, and she gave her a manicure and a pedicure because my mother had been complaining that her hair was a mess and that she didn't look her best. We made sure that she had her makeup. And she felt better about herself because she looked more like the person that she knew herself to be rather than just a sick person. And so it struck me, especially as I was watching my sister cut my mother's hair, she's using nail polish and emery boards and scissors. These are sacramentals. This is a sacramental ritual that she's doing out of love for my mother to help her feel more alive, more human, more herself. And it also struck me, all of my sisters, my middle sister is, she does home decoration. She's a decorator. So she kind of devotes herself to making people's homes beautiful. My oldest sister can transform someone who comes into her shop looking pretty shabby into someone who leaves looking awfully good. She could make the bride the most beautiful person in the room. She restores people's confidence in themselves. And my job, basically, as a poet, is to create, when on a good day, a beautiful artifact out of language. My own attraction to language is the attraction of beauty. And so I thought it's so interesting that I was able to see all of us, all four of us women in this room, doing something in the service of beauty, which is also in the higher service of love. And so all of our activities were sacramental in trying to bring beauty into that room. So that was a kind of transformative chapter for me because I realized how much of my mother needed to be in this book. When I first started writing it, I thought, okay, I could just make this a meditation on sacrament. Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3. And then I realized, ripped out of the context of who we all are and were as individuals, it wouldn't hold any water. It wouldn't be convincing to anybody. And so I needed to make it more personal, even though I was trying to avoid the personal, in part because it was painful, but also in part because I wasn't sure that the reader would necessarily be interested in the particular. But as a poet, I love the particular. And as a listener, when we read stories, for example, stories are all about the particular. You want to know, the names and the places and the setting and, exactly what it is that people said. So I thought, well, if this is going to be a story that's worth telling, then it needs to have these particulars.
Angela, I love hearing you talk about your family and then kind of get into a little bit how your sisters and you differ, but also how you all are drawn to this idea of beauty. Where did your particular connection to words and poetry and in the context or integration of our Catholicity, where did that come from? Was it from your mother, from your family, or where did it originate?
That's a good question. The first chapter actually is called The Sacrament of Speech, and it talks about the fact that as a family, 5 children, 5 boisterous children, 5 mouthy children, language was very important to us. And we had a lot of different, and all families have this, a lot of different languages going on in the house. Well, for one thing, my father was bilingual, and he spoke Sicilian. And my mother also, her father spoke Italian. So we had those languages that were part of the household makeup. And they were sort of song-like and lyrical, and we didn't understand them. So we had a sense of that world of language. Then there was the world of language that we knew from school that we brought home, and that was very different and new to my mother. We had the language of pop culture. We listened to the radio all the time. We had contemporary music on all the time. My mother loved the old Italian singers. And so we had one of those big Magnavox stereos. I love the word Magnavox. It means big voice. We had the Magnavox stereo. And so we always had Mario Lanza, Jerry Vale, Connie Francis, Tony Bennett, Al Martino, Frank Sinatra. That was the background music to our childhood. And in between, then we would put on, the soundtrack from Woodstock or whatever, So there was always this sense of language, music that was just part of the patter of our lives. I think another very important formational experience for us, though, was Mass. Going to church, I remember it always used to strike me. My mother did not go to high school, and so her purchase on, academic language was absolutely nil. She was not a good speller. She did not have a big vocabulary. But we would go to church, and I would sit next to her while she was singing the various hymns. And I remember hearing her sing to one of the words to one of the hymns, "Infinite thy vast domain, everlasting is thy reign." I remember thinking, I have no idea what those words mean, and I'm sure she doesn't either, but that's part of our faith, that we have this very elevated language that takes us out of the ordinary and the everyday, and that gestures towards the transcendent. There was something poetic about it. There was something very beautiful. It was certainly rhythmic. And I think my own interest in poetry probably came from, that's the only place I got exposed to poetry, really.
Sure.
So we didn't have books in my house until I went to school, was the language of the Mass, the language of prayer, the language of the hymns, all of which we knew and which we loved. So that was sort of the groundwork of it. But I also, this is my big secret, I really wanted to be a singer because that's what I heard on our stereo. I wanted to be able to have a lovely voice and sing these songs, and that simply was not to be. And I figured out then that poetry was the next best thing to singing, and that gave me a voice. It gave me an opportunity to let my voice be heard through the word and through the page, not necessarily, through the microphone. So I credit my mother with that in many ways. And it's also very interesting to me, there aren't that many great Italian-American poets. There are a lot of great Italian-American singers and movie makers, but for some reason they don't tend to become poets. So I thought, I'm going to break that mold and do something a little different, but still very much in keeping with that love of song, love of rhythm, love of music, the music of language.
I love one common theme just hearing you talk about the book and about your own life, just how clear it is you want to bring out again sort of the sacramental idea that there's so much that we take for granted in going on around us, and I love that you came to this particular story with the story of your mother, because I'm sure for so many people this is a huge part of their own life, in a certain stage of their lives, taking care of their elderly parents or being taken care of as an elderly parent. I've taken up a lot of your time already, but I wonder if you could just take us to the book is called The Sacramental Farewell. I mean, a lot of people are also having similar memories, similar stories. What was the sacramental context that helped you, I guess, understand the end of the story, if you will?
It's a very interesting question. We knew as this was going on, as this was transpiring, sure, that we were heading towards the end. And it's an end that should not surprise us.
Sure.
We all die, and it's all a matter of how it happens. We don't know when it's going to happen, but how it happens. And my sisters and I felt tremendously privileged to be able to be with her for not only for the last 48 days as she was, gradually deteriorating, but the last hours of her life. To be in the room with her, in the hospice room with her, as she was, she was not really conscious. She was on very heavy pain medication, but we knew that she could hear us. And we spoke among ourselves. We spoke to her constantly. My son called at one point, one of my sons, and I allowed him to speak with her on the cell phone. She could hear him. I could tell by her responses. And he said, "I love you, Grandma. I miss you. I wish I were there." Some of the last words that she heard were from, her grandchild, again, through that miraculous thing, the cell phone, telling her how much he loved her. And I felt like we eased her from this life into the next one, that the circumstances could not have been better than to have 3 of your children, if not all of them, 3 of your children there with you. She was there when I came into the world. I was there with her as she was leaving it. I could only hope the same for myself when the time comes that my children can be there. So it was, and all of the things that we did in that sick room, again, I felt were sacramental as because we knew we were in connection with eternity as we were performing these simple rituals for her. So it was a great privilege, and it was a very profound experience.
Good. Well, Angela, thanks so much for giving us this gift and this insight into that profound experience with so many people share indeed. The book is Mortal Blessings, A Sacramental Farewell. And again, thank you so much for spending some time with us and telling us a little bit about it.
Thank you so much, Jared. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Take care, Angela.
Thanks. You too.